everyone, not just the few.
Voices from the Road on C-SPAN. Up next, Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney discusses impeachment, trade, and the deficit. He spoke at the annual Wall Street Journal CEO Council meeting.
We're going to talk now with Mick Mulvaney about the White House's expectations for this next year, but there's a lot of news to cover as well. So please welcome Mick. There is a bit of news.
I'm trying to remember what socks I wore this morning.
Let's maybe start with the news, and then we can get into the agenda for the White House, not just for this next 12 months, but for a possible second term. What the White House is what the White House is thinking. So the Congress is very busy drawing up articles of impeachment. They've designed 2 of them. One of them has to do with Ukraine and the president putting pressure on Ukraine to investigate his political rival. President Trump has said that he'd like to see you and Secretary Pompeo testify in the Senate. Will you?
And part of me really wants to. If those of you who paid any attention at all, there's no reason for you to do. But I remember when I testified when I was running the CFPB to the House and the Senate, some of the most fun I've ever had when I was on the Hill. We'll do whatever the President wants us to do, is what it comes down to. So if the Senate decides to take live witnesses and the President directs us to do it, we will. If it directs us not to, we won't. That's how you work when you're, especially when you're in the White House. Even more so for me than for Mike. You're in an agency outside the White House. There's a little bit of distance, but you're inside the White House. You do what the President tells you to do.
Yeah. So if
he doesn't bother me to do that.
If he says go ahead, I mean, he's changed his mind on these things in the past, including whether or not he was going to testify before kind of previous investigations, the Russia investigation. If he asked you to testify, what would you say?
Right, I wouldn't say that at all. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to say. But part of me really wants to, because one of the things we deal with is people ask me all the time, so how you doing? How are you handling this? And I'm like, this is what it's like. This is how I'm handling it. You sit there on TV, and I want you to imagine going through the worst possible divorce that you've ever been through or you've ever heard of. And then your spouse gets to go on TV every single day and give his or her side of the thing, and you have to sit home and watch it on TV and take it. That's extraordinarily frustrating because you sit there and go, that's wrong, that's not right, boy, that's not even close to being right, and you do want to go out and tell your side of the story. But there's
consider this your opportunity
exactly
to,
right. There's a time and a place for that. Folks ask, they say, why didn't you go down and testify for the House? Well, first of all, the President told us not to. But number 2, I mean, who in this room would go under those circumstances without your lawyer? Really? Does that make sense? And not knowing what the rules are before you go to court, you know what the rules are. I'm not sure. I'm still not sure today what the rules are in the House. Yesterday I saw something as a former House member that was so bizarre that it's hard to describe to folks who don't follow Washington, D.C. But we had a staffer go down and sit behind the table and testify, not under oath, was not sworn in. The other 2 were, but the first one was, Barry Burke, I think is his name, was not sworn, but he presented testimony, refused to answer questions about that testimony, then left and went and sat up on the dais to ask questions of the other 2 people they were sitting next to. For anybody who follows Washington, D.C., that is the most outrageously bizarre thing I think we've seen in terms of procedure in a long, long time. So this is the wild, wild west of process, and you can't sort of lend legitimacy to it by treating it like it's an ordinary process.
So in that process, though, Sondland, the Trump-appointed ambassador to the European Union, says that you were in the loop on everything. The president's effort to pressure Ukraine to announce an investigation of the Bidens and to investigate this debunked server issue in return for Ukraine getting an audience with the president and military aid. He said you, Pompeo, everybody were in the loop on everything. What's your response? What's your response to that?
I'm not going to testify here today, but I will remind everybody what Sondland said, which is that he very rarely talked to me and couldn't get me on the phone. So,
that said, but he said you were in the loop.
The Democrats have certainly picked and chose what they want to say. By the way, the reason I was a few minutes late, and I do apologize, was that I was trying to catch the articles of impeachment as they were being introduced, and they were about 10 minutes after 9 o'clock. So they're very specific, which is, as you mentioned, the first article is an article for abuse of power, abuse of authority. I think it's abuse of power. And the other one is an article regarding obstruction of Congress. This should surprise nobody. Okay? That's what this was going to be from the very beginning anyway. Keep in mind, I think it's 16 members of the House Democrat Judiciary Panel had already voted in favor of impeachment before this process started. There was a vote this past summer on another matter regarding impeachment. They all voted for it. But here's my point to you, and again, I know you're doing your job, and I appreciate that, so we're not going to sit here and make the case one way or the other. I'm simply going to point out this is a political process, not a legal process. It's not judicial. The facts...
All true.
Really
and impeachment is a political process.
It is.
But Sondland said this about you. Yeah. Do you have a response to Sondland?
I would very much look forward to the opportunity, if the president instructs me to tell my side of the story. Look forward to it.
Sounds like the White House is taking the fifth.
No.
Why not just say?
John, that's just not right. You take the fifth when you're in court. That's not what this is. This is a kangaroo process, and I don't mean to be too energetic about this, but this was never a level playing field. You're never given the opportunity to tell your side of the story. Again, would anybody in this room go into that setting without the White House counsel? That makes no sense at all. Would you go in not knowing who's going to be able to ask you questions and for how long? Keep in mind, a couple different times during this process, the rules changed in the middle of the hearing. There were opening comments where you and I, you're going to talk for 45 minutes, and I'm going to talk for 45 minutes, and we'll let everybody else 5 minutes. And then you do your 45, I do my 45, and then I say, and I'm going to take another 20 right now. These things actually happen. This is Washington, D.C. It's wrong to sort of equate this. Again, it's natural to equate it maybe with the process that you've seen in court, taking the fifth, for example, giving evidence. But that's not what this is. This is a campaign. And if you've ever been involved in a campaign, I've been involved in many of them, they're not like anything else. You can't treat them like
Okay, my last question on this, so that we can move on. Sure. But I still haven't gotten an answer from you. The press conference in October.
Not asking the right question.
The press conference in October. The press conference in October that you got a lot of heat for seemed to me to be a moment of notable clarity in all of this. You said politics gets into everything, including foreign policy.
Right.
That's a position that was supported by Sondland, Taylor, Hill, Vindman. They all testified saying that politics were all over Ukraine policy. So my last question, it seems to be that there's agreement. Politics was all over.
I'll speak to this as a more general point, because it did come up in the press conference, but it's a more general point, because this is the point I was making in that press conference. Politics is going to affect foreign policy. There's no question about it. In fact, one of the things that stood out in my mind watching the testimony of some of the career staffers who testified was they said, well, it used to be that politics ended at the water's edge. And what they meant by that was different than what I've always interpreted that to mean. What I've always interpreted that to mean is that you and I you might be a Democrat, I might be a Republican, or vice versa, but once we leave the country, we're all on the same page. That's what I always thought that phrase meant, that politics ends at the water's edge. And that if you happen to be the Democrat president, you get to set foreign policy, because that's one of the things the Constitution lets the president do, right? If I happen to be a Republican, I set policy. I'll follow you when you're in charge. You follow me when I'm in charge. We have one American vision overseas. That's not what the career staffers meant when they were testifying. What they meant is foreign policy is much too important to allow politics to play any role. We have to have this professional career staff sort of make these decisions so that it doesn't get dirtied by American politics. I happen to completely disagree with that. I think that's dangerous. I dealt with the exact same thing over at the CFPB. Elizabeth Warren took the position that consumer protection in financial services was too important for politics. Go back and read the story of the founding of the CFPB, and that was exactly the point. The reason there was only one political appointment at CFPB was that Elizabeth wanted this to be above politics. I find that to be extraordinarily dangerous. There is no such thing as a professional class running this government. We should not be run by technocrats who are not accountable to voters. Politics can and should influence foreign policy. You may have one foreign policy you're running on. I may have a different one. Whoever wins gets to set that foreign policy, and that was the point I was trying to make in that press conference, was that politics can and should influence foreign policy, and hopefully always will.
But stopping short of getting another country to investigate your political rival.
Yeah, that's, well, again, I'm not going to go into the facts. You're doing a nice job, and I appreciate it.
Just asking.
But I'm not going to talk about the facts until the president tells me.
All right, so USMCA looks very close. We had a good conversation on this last night.
I can't believe you couldn't get Jared and Nancy on the stage at the same time. I thought that would have been great.
USMCA seems to be moving forward. That's hugely important to this audience. We got a good brief on that last night. Let's talk about the next trade deal, China.
Yeah.
December 15 is the deadline that the administration has given. It is willing to raise tariffs further on China. Is that likely to happen?
Likely. I'm not going to sit here and try and move markets, and I apologize because I know that would be good for you guys. But here's what I'll say about that: is that I think what happens on December 15th, I think, will have a lot to do with what happens between now and December 15th. What's the trajectory of the discussions at that time?
What are the trajectory?
I think they're pretty good. I talked to Wilbur this week.
Wilbur Ross.
Wilbur Ross this week. I talked to Lighthizer just yesterday, and again this morning.
The
I talked to Jared. And I think that the trajectory towards a Phase 1 deal is pretty good. Now, the Phase 1 deal is sort of the smaller components, parts that deal mostly with trade and not with some of the structural issues. So a lot of the ag discussion you've heard would be bound up in Phase 1. But I think it makes perfect sense, given the complexities of the deal, to break it down into smaller pieces to see if you can, walk before, crawl before you, or walk before you can run, and crawl before you can walk. And so if we can make some progress on Phase 1. Here in the next couple of days and weeks, I think that will impact what happens on December 15th.
Phase 1 has been generally described as you're buying more agricultural goods from us, we're lowering some selective tariffs.
I've seen that description. I think that's probably not unreasonable.
Yeah. So that seems to be, at best, a return to a status quo. And it's after tariffs have been imposed that have cost consumers, after taxpayers have had to pay additional funds to farmers who were hit by retaliatory tariffs in China. So it's really not even a return to the status quo. It's a half step back to the status quo, and at some cost to the United States. Not a great report card for 3 years of negotiating.
No, I disagree with that. I mean, certainly we wouldn't be having any of these conversations if Donald Trump wasn't president. And this was always going to be hard. I mean, and I think everybody, regardless of how you feel about the president, certainly in this room, I think everybody recognizes the fact that at some point in time we were going to have these discussions with the Chinese. Now, I think many of us, myself included, wish those discussions had been 20 years ago, but they certainly couldn't wait another 20 years. So you were going to have the discussions, all right? So let's say better now than later. It was always going to be hard. I remember sitting down with some folks inside the White House early on when I was OMB. OMB handles we're the clearinghouse for not only the budgetary stuff, but also the regulatory affairs. And we're talking about how excited we were about the deregulatory successes that we had, and a little bit less excited about the legislative process we had made, even when the Republicans were in charge of the House. I remember telling folks, look, there's certain things that are easier than others in Washington, D.C. Dereg is easy because it's just us. Okay? We don't have to work with Congress to do most of our deregulatory agenda, which is why it's been so successful. You move down to legislation, which is sort of the next level of complexity, and it gets a little bit harder because then we have to convince Congress to do something, and even when they were run by our own party, that was hard. Now it's even more difficult. Trade deals are the hardest of those on that spectrum because you have to get another country to change its practices. And that can be really, really difficult to do. And we've seen that. At the root of all of this, what is the discussion with China about? It's about whether or not China wants to join the first tier of nations. You do a deal with Germany, you're not required to give away half your business to Germany, to a German-controlled entity in order to do business in Germany. And the chances of them participating in an orchestrated attempt to steal your stuff is probably low on your list of concerns about doing business in Germany. China needs to step up to that game. And that's going to be difficult to do. And you say it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps. That's not how I look. We look at the big picture. We are raising the issues that need to be raised, and I think in the long run, the country will be better off for it.
Yeah, I mean that assumes that China's concerned about its reputational, standing and wants to join the first tier. When in fact its economic model seems to be working quite well for it. But let's call it the poll question. Let's call it the poll question on this.
But is that sustainable?
It may not be.
It's only working to their advantage because we let it work to their advantage. And the Europeans let it work to their advantage. And you finally stand up and say, no, stop stealing my stuff. That's a fair conversation.
But those are the issues that the CEOs and that the rest of this country is waiting for. That's the big stuff. I mean, the smaller stuff is getting back into, you buy some of our goods, we'll lower tariffs, or we'll take a more favorable standing with you for some. The big stuff is subsidies of SOEs, of the state-owned enterprises. The big stuff is forced tech transfer. The big stuff is theft of intellectual property. And there we have not seen
but John,
progress.
That's just human nature. I don't care if you're Chinese or American or whatever, but I mean, it's always easier to do a big deal after you've done a small deal. It's always easier for me to sit down with one of your reporters for maybe an hour-long, on-the-record, detailed interview after I have a relationship with them over the course of time on smaller things. So I get what you're saying, but I think you're ignoring human nature, which is that if it's even more difficult to do the bigger deals first.
Yeah.
So doing something on a phase one basis to see if you can develop that relationship, develop the rapport a little bit, that just makes sense, and it's not surprising you're getting that from a businessman president.
Yeah, and it's fair for you to say that this has been in the works for 30 years, right? So the dissolution of the state-owned enterprises was supposed to happen right after, or very close to after, their ascension to WTO, and it didn't. But this has been now on the negotiating table for 20 years, including the last 3 years of your administration. So let me just read the question here for those who haven't answered yet. So U.S. trade talks with China over the next 12 months will produce A, no deal, B, a fig leaf deal. China buys some soybeans, U.S. drops some tariffs. C, meaningful deal, addresses some big issues like what Mick was just describing. And D, a comprehensive deal, meaning it really gets at those big issues. And while we're waiting for the answers to come in, President Trump has suggested that we might go past the election before a deal is struck. Is that language that's preparing the markets and the American people for the fact that?
I think it's just the president. I think it's just the president being honest, which is that he doesn't. I've seen this before. I was in the real estate business like this compared to some folks in this room who were in it like this, and certainly the president at a much different level than I was. But I've seen people with deal fever before. I've seen people who just work so hard on a deal, they have to have a deal, and at the end they're willing to do anything to get that deal. I've been on both sides of that equation in my career. That doesn't exist here. So I think you're just seeing the president take him his word on that, which is, look, I'll do a deal if I get a really good deal, but I'm not in any hurry. I think I got a lot of the cards here. I think he probably does. I think our economy has proved much more resilient than people expected. To your point earlier about the cost borne by the American taxpayer, look, I was on that side of the argument interior to the White House, other folks, on who would pay the tariffs. But when you put the tariffs on and inflation goes down, it makes it, and the currency devalues, the yuan devalues. There's a real strong argument that the American economy, consumers are not paying for much of the tariffs, or at least as much as we thought they were. So, listen, it's a very vibrant situation, but I don't think you're seeing the president going, I have to have a deal by the election in order to win re-election. You're just not seeing that.
So it looks like the room is pretty much split, but a little bit more kind of, in your view of things, that we'll probably get a meaningful deal.
I'd have a little bit more even distribution there, probably. I think a comprehensive deal, you were only, 3.23%? I think that's the next 12 months.
Let's move on to another sticky subject, the deficit. If we could pull up the chart on that, Danny, just to show kind of what's happened.
It'll be a lot of red.
let's show what's happened to the deficit. So we can understand why in 2009-10 this happened. But look what's happening to the deficit here. Over the last 3 years of some of the best jobs number and some of the strongest economy we've had in years, it's growing. You were once a deficit hawk.
Oh,
you're a Tea Party man.
Yeah, no, Tea Party.
You're a Tea Party man. What happened? What's going on here?
Here's what's happened. And the years that really bother me the most were, I guess it was the budget years 17 and 18, because that's when the Republicans held the House, the Senate, and the White House. The deficit numbers were way too big then. And people say, "Oh, Mulvaney, you're the budget director. You're a deficit hawk. How could you allow this to happen?" Well, the truth of the matter is, our budget was what the president. What's a president's budget? The president's budget is essentially, people say it's a messaging document. Yeah, and the message is, if the president were in charge, this is what the spending would look like. And that budget had dramatically smaller deficits than on there. What that exposes is that even when the Republicans are in charge of the House, some Republicans like spending money as much as Democrats. It's hard to stop spending money.
How much does that expose the tax cut that you gave the companies in this room and the rest of
No, I'm not concerned about that at all. This is people always say, oh, you know, it's the tax cuts are big. No, it's not.
This is a loss of revenues.
It's not. It's been a year since I've been out of the OMB office, so I'm going to do this by memory, so I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but this is the general concept. I think last fiscal year, not the one that just ended in September, but the year before that was the one I'm most familiar with, I think our deficit was, I don't know, $900 billion. Almost half of that only half of that was in mandatory spending. Only half of that was in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. The other half was on the discretionary side. My party has done such a good job of convincing ourselves that entitlements are the problem that we've ignored the discretionary part of the budget, and we spent a bunch of money. The Republicans on the Hill spent money. Keep in mind, Congress spends money. That's one thing they remind me every single time that I go down to the Hill to have budget discussions. They say, Mr. Mulvaney, thank you much for being here, but you know the Constitution lets us spend the money. And they're absolutely right, and they did. The increases that we saw when the Republicans were in charge of the House were almost as big as they were when the Democrats in charge of the House. It's hard to get members of Congress to stop spending money. When you say, well, but the president's just as much to blame, go look at his budget.
Your stated expectations were that the tax cut would stimulate the economy to the extent that the economy would grow faster than the deficit would accrue. And that hasn't happened.
Portions of it have. I think that if you drill down into the numbers, and again, it's been a year since I've looked at this, I think almost all of the deficit that's attributable to the tax deal is related to the earned income, the child care tax credit. The corporate tax cut actually did exactly what we said that it would do, generated a fair amount of revenue. So I'm very, very pleased with the results of that. And certainly we have no complaints about the amount of growth that we have. But no, the deficits are rough. There's no question. Look, there's a bunch of Republicans who are walking around right now in this town saying deficits don't matter, and they're pointing to that. And honestly, I don't know what to tell them anymore, because I fought that for a long time. I think they're supposed to matter. They should matter. But they haven't, and I wish we weren't borrowing as much as we are. But until there's a change in the center of gravity of both parties on the Hill, you're unlikely to get it.
Yeah, and it's the deficit contributing to an ever-growing national debt.
Yep.
Before we go to questions, one last one for you. So we've just talked about things that you're going to be dealing with over the next several months. It's the end of January 2021. The president has been reelected to a second term. Yeah. What's the top three agenda items for a second term, where it doesn't have to worry about the filter of reelection?
It's the stuff that we think it's very unlikely that we're going to get done on a legislative standpoint. Again, go back to that sort of that spectrum of regulatory change, legislative change, and then trade change. We're going to continue to do stuff in the regulatory scheme from now as long as we're here. Okay. Legislatively, there's not a lot of time left in this Congress. If you think that even in a good year, a good even number year, Congress is pretty much finished by 4th of July, and sometimes Memorial Day, you've got, 4 months maybe worth of legislative time between the first of the year and the time that Congress leaves just to go out on its reelect. That's magnified a little bit dramatically in a presidential year. So it's a very short window to get major legislation done. We will be pushing for changes to prescription drug prices. There's no question. Do I think there's a very good chance we get that legislatively? I'm not going to say no, there's not a good chance, but I think it's going to be very difficult to do, especially in the political environment that we're in. So we'll continue to push it from a regulatory agenda, but legislatively gets difficult. So to answer your questions, what starts January of 2021 is the stuff that we'd love to do now, but there's either no time or there's no attitude, no atmosphere on the Hill to get it.
And that being?
That would be prescription drugs is going to be a big one. Trade will continue to be a big part of it. I think the president would love to see further refinements to tax policy. He was always disappointed we couldn't get that corporate tax rate down just a little bit more, so we're going to continue to push those types of things, also to make some of those cuts permanent. Now that we've proven that they can work, and that they do stimulate the economy, and the supply side economics works. And by the way, this wasn't your question, but people ask me sometimes, what's been the biggest success? I think 20 years from now, when they write the history of the first term of the Trump administration, it will be that we prove that supply side economics works. and that you can have significant growth without significant inflation. You can bring millions of people into the workforce. We've brought 5 million more people into the workforce than the Congressional Budget Office projected on the day of the election. 5 million more, yet we have no inflation. That supply-side economics works. We'll continue to try to push that in the second half of the administration.
Questions for Mick Mulvaney? Let's go right back here to Paul, and then Martin, I'll come to you.
Thank you, John. Paul Das from BGD Holdings. Thank you for your service. I'm curious about your thinking. Last evening, when the advisor to the president, Mr. Kushner, was speaking about immigration, he alluded to Australia's merit-based system as being central. I would want your thinking, further color on that. How appropriate it is fundamentally going to rethink our idea of immigrants when you go to a merit-based system. Australia's population is around 25 million, its history and civilization is vastly different from ours. How do you see it reshaping who we are as a country, aside from the business need for folks who need to be doing the manual work as much as manning the PhD work?
Yeah, well,
thank you.
And that's where I'd start on the answer, which is I think we all recognize we're getting to the point where we need the people, right? We really do. The president is not anti-immigrant. He's not anti-immigration. He just remembers the mistake that Reagan made. Reagan gave amnesty in exchange for border security, but never got the second half of the deal. So this president, not the president ever interested in amnesty, he was like, look, we're not going to talk about fixing legal immigration until we fix illegal immigration. We're going to handle the border security matters first. And by the way, that goes just beyond the southern border. The southern border only, on any given year, approximates roughly half of our illegal immigration. The rest of it is typically overstays. So they come in from all over the world through all sorts of ports of entry. So fixing the illegal immigration is sort of a precursor. It's a precondition, a prerequisite to fixing legal immigration. But what you've seen us telegraph in terms of reforms to immigration, I think really get to one of the president's priorities for the second term, which is, okay, we need people. We need people across the skills spectrum. And if we go to a merit-based system, or at least move more towards a merit-based system and less towards a family tree type of based system, that will benefit the economy, benefit the country. So, it doesn't get that much attention. I was surprised by that because I thought it'd be one of those things that would sort of kick up interest on both the left and the right. But when we rolled that out 6 months ago, it was a story for a couple of days and then went away. But we will continue to look at it, and it will be on that list of things for the second term.
Okay, I see another question over here. Let's go to Martin.
Yeah, it seems to me that the trade deal is the tip of the iceberg. The real issue is America's relationship with China. Do you see a pathway to peaceful coexistence with China or not?
I do. As with any relationship, any relationship by definition would be mutual. So to the extent they look at the world as a zero-sum game, that they have to dominate in the areas that I think it was the China 2025 plan they used to talk about, at least I don't know if they still talk about it as overtly as they used to. If it's a zero-sum game, that creates difficulties. If there's a way to sort of get everybody's interests aligned, then I think you've got a tremendous opportunity. I think that there's tremendous opportunities with some of the other larger nations as well that have gone underdeveloped. I think our relationship with India, for example, could use cultivation. It's 1.5 billion people. It was very interesting, by the way, when we met with President Xi in Osaka. The topic of India came up, and one of the things that he pointed out was that he knew the exact date to the year that India would have more people than China, or I think they're getting close now. He talked about the population growth in India and the lack of population growth in China. So I think there's a lot of opportunity with the other nations as well, in addition to just China. Not a very good answer.
We have time.
But I'm sitting here looking at the zeros flash at me because
we have time for just one more real quick question. Did I see one right here? Steve, do you want to? Yeah, let's get one right here.
So healthcare, you mentioned prescription drug pricing as one of the top 3 priorities.
Yeah.
Why is healthcare and prescription drugs, if you can talk about that, why is prescription drugs so important?
Because it's important to folks back home. That's the bottom line. I mean, it's important. If it's important to ordinary Americans, or the president. I've said this before, and I know this is bizarre, and I know I'm probably speaking to people in this room who probably meet half of this definition. but he's a billionaire man of the people. I'm neither, so I'm stunned by both of those things. But he does have the ability to sort of listen to, channel, and understand what we would call ordinary Americans, blue-collar Americans, middle class, use whatever term you want to. And he understands what's important to them. He started talking more and more on the road about traffic. Given this is a man who hasn't driven himself in years and now doesn't drive in traffic. They closed down the Long Island Expressway when we were on that case. But he still understands it's important to folks back home. And I don't know how he does it, but he does it, and he knows that that's important to them, so that's why it's important to him.
Mick Mulvaney, thank you very much for joining us.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
The House will be in order.
For 40 years, C-SPAN has been providing America unfiltered coverage of Congress, the White House, the Supreme Court, and public policy